Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all very much for joining us here for the Translating the Gap between Cisco and AWS. This is going to be our first out of three sessions. Today, we're going to be focusing on the ASAv. My name is John Gardner from Sunset Learning Institute. I'll be your host today. One of the first things that we want to do here, folks, is we'd really like to know where everybody sits with on-prem security, cloud security, virtualized security. So I'm actually going to enable a poll here. We just got two questions here. So if you folks could take that poll, we'd really appreciate that. And while you're doing that, just a quick reminder, if we have questions during the session, if you could do us a huge favor, if you could put those questions in the Q&A window, we'd really appreciate it. It allows us to keep track of, who's asking questions and if we've answered them. With that being said, we're on a little bit of a tight schedule here. So if we are not able to answer questions for you folks, we'll go ahead and we'll be able to get back to you after the session. Okay. Looks like we've got some good participation here in the polls. Thank you all very much. And so with that, let us go ahead and get started. So the first thing that I want to do here is let's talk about our agenda. So there's two major points that we're going to talk about here. First, I need to explain the function of what an adaptive security appliance is. I do want to talk about what does it look like, or what do we use it for inside a physical environment, a virtualized environment, and a cloud environment. So that's the first thing here, is talking about the purpose of the ASAv technology. Then what I want to do is I want to get into the requirements. What do we need from an ASAv perspective and from an AWS cloud perspective to install this in the AWS cloud? I'm also getting into the virtual appliances. There's a couple of different versions that we have, but what is the virtual appliances and virtual constructs that are needed inside the AWS cloud to get this up and running? Then, excuse me, the main point here is to get into translating the AWS virtual private cloud concepts into a traditional Cisco networking construct. So when we say something in AWS like a VPC, what does that traditionally mean for a Cisco engineer or somebody who understands Cisco technology and terminologies? So let's just go ahead and jump right in here, folks. So let's talk about what an ASAv is and what the purpose is. So the first thing is the ASAv itself, the virtualized appliance. It's a virtualized appliance, security appliance that sits on your system. Its main purpose is to provide advanced security services and also some features for internal and external access. So for instance, software-based firewalling, VPNs, intrusion prevention and intrusion detection systems. These are all very, very important security constructs. And what I want to do next here, just real quick, is I want to jump into each one of those functions. So the first thing here is network security. We've all heard of firewalling, intrusion prevention, and VPNs. The major concept for an adaptive security appliance is really this intrusion prevention and intrusion detection. Now, I don't have a lot of time to get in depth into what that means, but as a high level overview, intrusion prevention essentially means that we're going to watch the traffic flows and we're going to match them up against things that we understand are malicious and things that are benign. And so when we do see something that does look malicious, we can go ahead and flag that as a possible intrusion. Now, the firewalling, this is a standard firewalling. And give me one moment here. There we go. So this is standard firewalling. These are ACLs, right? Permit traffic in, permit traffic out, but in and out of our network. But also keep in mind that we also use this to permit traffic between different environments in our organization. So this could be, firewalling the salespeople from the marketing people, as an example. The other big thing here is the VPN. We want to have secure remote access to our environment. And again, this could be a physical server on our network. This could be a virtual machine inside of an ESXi host, or this could be an EC2 instance inside of our AWS cloud. Now, with that being said, the virtualized environments, a lot of people ask me, John, where is the ASAv? Where is it supported, right? So the big one is obviously, and this is the one that we're going to talk about today, is VMware, right? So it is supported inside of ESXi. It's also supported inside of Hyper-V and KVM. With that being said, again, we're going to focus on the VMware deployment. Now, with that said, you're going to go to cisco.com. You're going to download it as an OVA file, Oscar Victor Alpha, an OVA file, and you're going to deploy it inside of ESXi. By the way, I am going to take a short sidestep in a little bit and show you how that's done real briefly. We can also, excuse me, deploy this inside the cloud. So this essentially becomes a virtual machine inside of your public cloud. Now, again, people ask me, where is this supported? Well, it's supported right now, AWS, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure or Azure, however you say it, and the Google Cloud Platform. So we do have, that flexibility there. Now, getting into the traffic inspection and filtering, one of the things to note here is the ASAv does what's called deep packet inspection. As I mentioned earlier, it watches the flows and it analyzes that traffic. For instance, a perfect example here, folks, is we have a list of bad actors, IPs that we have blacklisted and we know are bad actors. So what we do is during deep packet inspection, we'll line that up, the source and destination IP, as an example, just to make sure that we're not receiving or sending to a bad actor. Another example is protocols and port numbers. And we can filter based upon all of this information, right? So source and destination IP, protocols, port numbers, so on and so forth. Now, a couple of other things here. I did mention the VPN services. If you're familiar with an adaptive security appliance, if you're familiar with a standard ASA firewall, the ASAv actually does provide all of those same functions. So we've got IPsec, SSL, any connected VPNs for remote access users, but we can still also do site-to-site connectivity within, from, for instance, our AWS cloud to our home office, to our corporate office. Excuse me. Now, intrusion prevention. This is another example of deep packet inspection, where now we're looking even further into the content of what's inside that traffic. So we can see if there's an I love you virus, for instance, inside the traffic. And all we're doing is we're just looking for traffic patterns, port numbers that we've predefined. We've already seen this is what this virus looks like. If the data looks a lot like this virus, we're probably going to flag it. With that being said, there's a couple of things you can do once that happens with application visibility and control. So with the application traffic, we can say, you know what, black hole this traffic, deny the traffic, or permit it. So application visibility, we can see that there's that I love you virus, and we know we're going to go ahead and send that to quarantine. Another thing that the ASAv has that a standard physical ASA has, high availability and failover, right? So yes, you absolutely can install multiple ASAVs and have a primary and a failover. Absolutely. Excuse me. Now, there's a couple of other platforms. So the ASAv can be managed using Cisco security management platforms like the security manager, which is what we typically use. But by the way, if you're not familiar with Firepower, FTD, FMC, there's the Firepower Management Console or Firepower Management Center that does allow us to manage not just our firepower, but also our adaptive security appliances. Now, I did want to make a note here that the Cisco ASAv is designed to provide comprehensive security services for virtualization and cloud environments, offering protocol, control, visibility over network traffic to ensure a secure and compliant computing environment. In other words, this is a note stating that the ASA that you have been hearing about for since the dawn of time, the ASAv has those capabilities. We did not reinvent the wheel. We're keeping that wheel moving forward. With that being said, where exactly are we going to download this from? So sometimes if you've been on the Cisco download site, I'm sure some of you have had a hard time finding what you were looking for. I wanted to make sure that I linked you here. If you go to the download, Cisco download home, you're going to click on security, firewalls, adaptive security appliance, but then you're going to say secure firewall ASA virtual. That's where you're going to see a list of images that you can download. Now, you see this .bin, QCOW2, so on and so forth. What you're looking for instance, in our example, we're going to be using ESXi. What you're looking for there is a .ova file. What you're going to do is you're going to download that .ova file. You can download it to a file server on your network, or you can download it to your local machine. But the next thing we're going to do here is, and let me go ahead and remove the laser pointer. I'm actually going to bring up the installation of the ASAv here. Just this is from Cisco. We have all of the prereqs and all of the features, but the first thing you're going to do, and I'm not going to go through everything, I'm just summarizing the deployment here, just so you know. And I am also linking everyone, or I thought I was, one moment. I'm going to link everybody to the ESXi installation here. So if you go ahead and check out the chat window, you'll be able to click on the same link that I'm in right now. So the first thing you have to do is you have to unpack or download the ASAv software, which we just looked at. Go into the software download page. The next thing you're going to do is, now you can deploy this using VMware vSphere Web Client or vCenter. They're very, very similar. All you're going to do is go up to the top and say deploy from OVF. You're going to select your image, and then it actually runs through a wizard where you can name it, give it an IP address, and then eventually turn it on. At that point, folks, you now have an ASAv installed in ESXi. And yes, it is that simple. The next step would be to actually access the console and start running through your standard initial configuration dialog. This is setting up things like your management IP address, if you need to change it for any reason, and just getting basic connectivity to the device up and running. By the way, from there, you can absolutely use SSH to manage the device, or as we noted earlier, you can use the FMC. So we're going to go ahead and jump back in here. Okay, now that's what the adaptive security appliance is. How do we normally deploy it today inside of ESXi? The next step that I want to do is I want to start taking a look at what are some of the requirements for installing inside of an AWS cloud. So as we can see up here at the top, if you want to be able to deploy an ASAv inside of AWS, you got to follow these steps. And keep in mind, folks, there's more going on here, but I'm just doing a high level overview. The first thing you're going to have to do, you're going to have to get, and let me pull out my pointer here. You're going to have to get an AWS account. I think that goes without saying. You're also going to have to get a license. Keep in mind, just because it's a virtual appliance does not mean that it does not have to be licensed. We want to be able to license it so we can get things like IDS, IPS definitions, right? Every day, Cisco is finding new intrusion methods and new malware that we want to be able to push down to your ASAVs so that it's the most up to date. So with that said, the next thing you're going to do is inside of your AWS configuration, you folks are going to create an AWS virtual private cloud. Now, later, I'm going to translate that into what Cisco would normally call it. But for the sake of the conversation right now, this is your virtual private environment that you can spin virtual machines up and also virtual appliances. And as just a side note here, folks, I want to mention, it doesn't have to just be a firewall. By the way, we also support load balancers, firewalls, SSL offloaders, all of the standard L4 through 7 technologies that we're used to deploying inside of an organization or a data center is supported inside of your virtual private cloud. And I'm going to be showing you a couple of topology diagrams to impart that. Now, another thing is, who would have thunk, right? You kind of need to have subnets on your interfaces. I have to be able to route. By the way, that's another big function of an ASAV. It could be a routed adaptive security appliance, or it can just be an inline transparent intrusion prevention system. In this case, we can create subnets to route if we'd like, or at the very least, identify my internal and external subnets. The way you're going to do that is you're going to do this here on your ASAV instance. Now, another thing is security groups. Now, security groups is an AWS term. And again, you know, we're here to translate that gap. I'll let the cat out of the bag. They're ACLs. They're access control lists, right? So I'm going to show you what that looks like inside of your AWS configuration, so you know exactly what that looks like. And you'll notice, for anybody who's worked with ACLs in the past, they look just like the ACLs that we're used to seeing, right? The last thing here is our key pair. Now, this is very important because what this does is it creates a key pair with PKI between your EC2 instance and your ASAV instance. What does that mean for us from a Cisco perspective? The EC2 could be your management workstation to your firewall, right? And we're all used to hitting that management interface on the ASA with SSH. All we're saying is that you can hit that internally inside of your virtual private cloud, just like you do today, just in a cloud environment. Now, another thing that I wanted to do was show you where does the ASAV live inside of your AWS configuration. So the first thing I want to mention here is the VPC, the virtual private cloud. This is all of the stuff that's internal to our AWS cloud. By the way, I did throw in a couple of availability zones just to prove that, yes, we can have high availability and failover. Excuse me. Another thing here is the ASAVs, ASAV1 and ASAV2. What we're doing is we're creating an interface here that is connected to the public cloud, and we're going to call that outside. Now, let's step back for a second. If you're not familiar with zones, what the Adaptive Security Appliance brought to the table when it originally came out was zoning. The ability to say this is an outside zone, filter as such. This is an inside zone, filter as such. So obviously we want to do more filtering for traffic coming from the outside to inside than we would from maybe, let's say, my private network to my management network. These are internal to us. I'm pretty sure I'm not trying to send a virus from my private network to a management interface. So here we're going to create an outside interface or a outside zone on the ASAV and attach it to a public interface. By the way, this is going to be within the public subnet. Again, I'll translate that here in just a little bit, but essentially this is your public side IP. Now downstream, as you can see here, the ASAV is going to connect to my management network and my private network. So this zone is automatically going to be called our inside zone. So now we have inside network connectivity from virtual machines that are our customers or our users are on, being filtered going outbound and vice versa. Now, the rest of this stuff, I mean, yeah, we can talk about it later, but long story short, this is giving us access to other sites, other locations. But for the sake of this conversation, we're not really going to discuss down here. Now, with that said, I walked you through implementing in the ESXi environment. What I'd like to do now, as soon as I can find my pointer, there we go, is again, I'd like to summarize what is needed to deploy the ASAv on an AWS cloud. And let me go ahead and link everybody to that quick start guide. This is, and as you can see, it's not very long, right? It's actually not very long. So let's go ahead and plug that in there. Okay, in the chat window, folks, you should have the install through AWS Cloud. Excuse me. So first, it's going to mention, about the deployment. I have a example here in the next few slides about what type of instance you need. This is going to come down to the number of interfaces that you need to support virtually inside of your AWS cloud. So essentially, how many public and private interfaces do you require? Now, keep in mind, folks, that this was built out in 2018. Since then, I have the updated information here for the supported instance types. We can go all the way up to like 8 interfaces per ASAv. Now, the prereqs, you got to have a management interface, and you got to have an inside-outside interface on your ASA. This is what we just saw on the last slide. For the communication paths, what we're doing is, notice these are required inside and outside. These are the inside-outside zones that an ASAv requires to communicate. So what you're going to do is create an inside interface and an outside interface inside of AWS. But inside the ASAv, you'll create an inside-outside zone on those interfaces. Here's some guidelines and limitations. But other than that, let's see here. Perfect. So here's a standard example that we're going to see. You're going to have your ASAv. You create 3 interfaces, one for inside, one for outside, and one for DMZ. What you then do is attach those to AWS subnets. Again, I'll discuss that in a little bit, but letting the cat out of the bag, it essentially means it's an IP network, right? Or you could even think of it as a VLAN. It's a construct that segments virtual machines into their own group. In AWS, we call them subnets. In Cisco, we call them IP subnets or networks or VLANs. Now, we already talked about deploying the ASA in ESXi, but what you're going to do is you're simply going to go here to your account management console, and then inside there, you'll see all of your virtual constructs. You're going to open up your VPC and start the VPC wizard. And then it's going to, and as you can see, not much else, right? It's going to walk you through what device would you like to deploy, which we've already got the ISO image, so we can simply deploy it on our VPC as a quote unquote virtual machine and build the configuration just like what we saw in ESXi. Okay, let me move this out of the way here, folks. So many windows. All right, so as I mentioned before, we have a couple of different installation options for the ASAv inside of the AWS cloud. This is the 2023 version of the table that you just saw. in my little diagram there. And as you can see here, maximum number of interfaces. Oh, okay. Should probably get that laser pointer back out. As you can see, we have a couple of options here, a couple of EC2 instances that are available that can take us all the way up to 8 interfaces. And I did search around as of right now inside of AWS. Yes, 8 interfaces is the maximum today. All right. So with that being said, folks, the last thing we have to do is we have to talk about the constructs that we just discussed in AWS, like subnets, VPCs, so on and so forth, and translate them into what a Cisco engineer would recognize. And so what are the major AWS components needed for an ASAv in AWS Cloud? And what are their translated counterparts? Now, I want to throw it out there, folks, that I actually, I put in a couple more in here that are optional, but I wanted to make sure that if you were running through the configuration and it asks you, hey, you want to do a NAT gateway? I wanted to make sure you knew what that NAT gateway was in a Cisco deployment. So with that being said, the first thing here is your VPC. Now, I liken this to a tenant inside of Cisco, right? So if you're familiar with application-centric infrastructure or UCS, you know what we do is we group configurations of certain customers into a construct called a tenant. And then what do? We hand them out an IP block. That's exactly what a VPC is. So when you're going through the wizard, and you can see a VPC is an isolated portion of the AWS cloud. It doesn't talk to any other VPCs unless you hook them together, which is absolutely doable, by the way. That's a transit gateway, and that's a little above the talking points here for today. But as you can see here, AWS even puts in tenancy, right? This could be multi-tenancy. So I could have one VPC, or I can subdivide a VPC, just like we see with multi-tenancy in Cisco with things like ACI and UCS. Now, subnets. I think it's pretty simple, but let's go ahead and jump in here. Notice the VPC. We gave it a 10.0 with a /16 subnet. That can be sectioned out or subnetted, as we like to call it, right? And so here we've created 2 subnets. What is a subnet? It's a subnet. There's a little number for you, but you can call it an IP network, a VLAN, an IP subnet. A subnet is a subnet is a subnet, whether it's in Cisco land or in AWS land. Now, here's the one that a lot of people may not be familiar with, an EC2 instance. An EC2 instance, think of it as a container that allows you to put an application in and share that application out. Boy, that sure does sound like a server, right? Or today's virtual machines. That's because it is simulating a virtual machine. It is essentially AWS's version of a virtual machine. And as you can see here, these can be plugged in through a subnet. So we're going to create an EC2 instance inside that subnet and attach it via an interface. Just like we do today with VLANs and switching connected to a router, we're doing the same thing inside of our virtualized cloud. Now, excuse me. So the next thing here is, as you can see, we've subdivided into 3 subnets. Guess what? You can create routes or a routing table inside of AWS. By the way, folks, what that actually is it's simply a static route. So when we see routing or routing table entries, I know it lends itself to the understanding that it is a static route, but excuse me, inside of AWS, this is how we would create those static routes. This is how we would do path manipulation inside of your AWS cloud. Because let's be honest, folks, one of the neat parts about utilizing, routing is the fact that you can manipulate where things can go based upon where they came from. Now, this was a piece that I really wanted to get to because a lot of people see security groups and they think SG, right? Security groups with ICE, Identity Services Engine, right? And so there's a little confusion there. These are not the same security groups that we're used to in ICE. These security groups inside of AWS are actually our ACLs. And you can see them right here. I got an inbound ACL that is going to permit HTTPS using port 80 to anywhere. Awesome. Let's allow that through IPv6 also. And let's allow SSH to anywhere. Inbound, right? I don't know if that's the best option there for security, but normally what you would see here is, I would put a source here and have it be from one specific subnet. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about here is the NAT gateway. Now, the NAT gateway, what it truly is, folks, is when you spin this NAT gateway up, what you're really doing is saying inside interface, outside interface. Where do we normally see that? That inside-outside interface? Yes, we see it in zones in the ASA, but we normally see that in a NAT translation statement. So that's exactly what this NAT gateway is doing, is it's attaching to different subnets and saying, you're my inside and you're my outside subnet. So a NAT gateway will translate from an internal subnet to a external subnet. And by the way, in this example, I wanted to make sure that I threw this out here, that you can go from a private network to another private network. We used to see that a lot when we wanted to kind of define where certain traffic was coming from in our logs back in the day. Don't see it too much anymore, but you could use NAT to translate from an internal network to an internal network, just like we used to, traditionally. So with that being said, folks, thank you very much for joining us here for our little tech talk on translating the gap. Please keep in mind that we do have an AWS Discovery Day securing your AWS cloud on October 13th. This is from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern. And also, we also have a AWS Security Essentials course. This is going to show you all the fundamentals of cloud security concepts, access control, encryption, and network access between your cloud environment and or another environment. This is going to be running November 7th. So please reach out to your SLI contact, and thank you all very much for joining us today. If you have any questions, please put those in the chat or in the Q&A window. Otherwise, again, thank you very much for your time.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click on the notification icon to get notified whenever we upload new content.